Good morning, and to some of you, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. We have an absolutely wonderful panel today, and it's coming in the second day of the program. We're talking about sustainability, and then we're moving from sustainability in its general sense into financial sustainability. How do we anchor sustainable development through finance? And the different types of finance, different sources of finance, different modes of finance. We have an absolutely wonderful panel. I greeted our participants around the world, and the speakers come to us from around the world. To my left is the Honorable Minister, Suzana Gasic from Bosnia and Herzegovina's Republika Srpska. And then we have Henry Briance from Certares. They're a private investment firm. And you will introduce a bit more about your firm as we speak. And virtually we have my friend, Loomba, who comes to us. I suspect today you're in India, but I've worked with him in Nepal and seen him in London getting awards and just doing a wonderful, wonderful job. And we'll hear about his great work in a bit. And Therese Turner-Jones from the Inter-American Development Bank. Good morning. I suspect it's about 4 a.m. your time, and thank you for waking up so early. And Mabena comes to us from South Africa, and lucky him, from Kruger National Park, that neighborhood. So we'll hear about what they're doing. And we may be joined by another expert, and we will introduce her at such time as she shows up. But Teresa, as a reward for you waking up so early, I'll start with you. And I would love to hear from you. You have such a large organization. You're working in Latin America and the Caribbean, supporting many countries with their economic development and social development. But when you're looking at sustainable tourism development, and specifically finance, what sort of criteria do you have when selecting the projects that you're going to finance?
Hi, good morning, everyone. It is early. It's about 5, not 4, but I got up about an hour ago. Thanks for the question, and thanks for having the IDB on this panel, and especially given the range of speakers here, we're really pleased to be contributing. So I want to start by saying that when we think about tourism investments in particular, especially in our region and the Caribbean, and other countries in Latin America, we have some of the most tourism-dependent economies on the planet in the region. And so it's really important that we get this right. So financing projects in the sector takes on a special role. Before the crisis, we were looking at, at least a minimum of 1/3 of the whole economy is somehow related to tourism. And as you can imagine, a large part of that is small, medium enterprises that feed into the big hotel investments in the region. So first of all, what we're looking for is what's the development impact of any particular project? And what do I mean by development impact and development effectiveness, for example? Who's benefiting from the project? It's not just the investor, it's not just the shareholders in the company, but what about the community? What about women? What about small, medium enterprises? How can we tighten up those linkages with agriculture, for example, thinking through all of the supply chain issues in tourism? So not just starting with transport and food and beverage industry, restaurants, crafts, even going as far as what happens to bio-waste at the end of the cycle, when we know that, for example, some properties, there's a lot of food waste left over. So there are a lot of issues to think about. And, we're looking to see how well either the developer or the investor has thought through these issues. And our job is really to make sure that the effectiveness that we'd like to see from these projects does really happen. And so we've been successful in working with investors to make sure that happens. And I can give you one good concrete example from a new business hotel that was being developed in Kingston, Jamaica, where we worked with the developer to make sure that not just that the architectural features of the property reflected, the environmental issues and confronting this particular neighborhood in Kingston, but also we used the project as an opportunity to train and upskill young people who we were working with to build their skills. And these were, at-risk youth, young men who had fallen, off the rails and had trouble with violence and so on. And we were putting them through a program where they could eventually get. We were working with. We also worked with local build their skills. And these were furniture, at-risk youth, young men who had fallen and so on in the hotel to make sure that this thing really was. We were maxing out the local content of the property, and that was fairly successful. I'll stop there.
Oh, very good. You're laying out a more comprehensive approach to selection of projects. So you're not just scoring them, it sounds, on the pure financials. And my question, a follow-up question would be, these other criteria, the non-financial criteria, of inclusion, of integration of the wider value chain, and that sort of thing. Is there a formal process of this? Is there like a scoring sheet, or how do you do it? How do you go about that?
So definitely there's scoring. And the scoring includes absolutely all the financial issues, but also looking at development effectiveness, which I just mentioned. But of course, today, in the Caribbean especially, we're looking at projects through the lens of climate change as well. Climate change is everybody knows on this planet right now, one of the biggest threats for sustainability. And so we're looking to make sure that all of the environmental safeguards are in place. And this is not new in terms of the IDB having a set of environmental and social safeguards. But what has happened in recent years has become more important. So whether it's making sure that hotel properties are not being developed in a predominantly mangrove area, for example. So the destruction of mangroves, which are natural sea defenses in the event of hurricanes and so on. So these issues have become much more important, and it also helps to sensitize citizens and also policymakers, because of course you can imagine that policymakers, their negotiating power vis-a-vis investors is sometimes limited because they're looking at it in terms of, wow, 1,200 new jobs in a particular neighborhood, and they may bypass environmental and social safeguards. So I think this is a really important aspect today to be thinking about. The other thing that I think is important to mention is that, given where the world is with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, a lot of corporates now have, as part of their corporate social responsibility sort of goals and guidelines, a lot of these elements already. So I think this is becoming easier to do. And sadly, I think where we have to do more work is convincing governments that this is really an important issue because of what I just described. Their horizon tends to be much more short-term. I want to win the next election, so this project is going to generate as much bang for the buck for me politically. So let's go ahead and let's not focus too much on these issues. Sadly, I've also seen this kind of debate going on in some countries.
Very good. Thank you. It's interesting to see that you have a determined process for vetting projects from an environmental standpoint. Andy introduced me as Chief of Party of USAID's Bosnia Herzegovina Sustainable Tourism Development Project. And the United States Agency for International Development, which is the development arm of the US government, has very strict environmental policies and regulations, what type of projects can be supported, and if you have a new idea for an expansion or a greenfield project, etc., it has to be vetted through this environmental lens. And at times, there may not be necessarily a negative impact, but maybe a question mark, and USAID says, well, do the due diligence and give the advice for mitigation. Doesn't mean you can't do the project, but as long as there's mitigation and risk management, then you can proceed, so long as you don't damage the environment negatively, of course. Wonderful. That leads us into maybe let me just jump from an international development bank into a private investment lens. Henry, your company predominantly makes private investments. I understand you have a debt fund, but predominantly you're a private investor.
That's right.
And your focus is on tourism and hospitality. Now, what does a project need to do to earn your interest in an investment?
It's a good and open-ended question. First, good to be here and good to meet everyone. And apologies that the perspective we'll be coming from is more of a, if you like, financial than purely developmental standpoint. But where it's interesting in this topic is how those two inevitably come together. So, Ibrahim, to your question, first and foremost, when we are fiduciaries of capital for our investors, and we are looking for opportunities to deploy that money to make a positive return for them. An important distinction for us as specialists in the travel sector and a long-term investor is that we are not looking for a quick flip or something where we can buy now because it's distressed, do something and dress it up for sale a year or two later. We are looking to make investments into company where the value that we make for our investors is through the growth and development of that company. And I should say that most of what I spend my time on is investing into businesses rather than, say, hard asset projects. And so to the example that was just raised around we would rarely be investing in a new development hotel, but all of our businesses in one way, shape, or form are touching projects like that in terms of where do people want to go, what are people prepared to pay, and what they care about for those things, and that is how this sort of interacts with sustainability. So fundamentally, what we're saying is looking for good, well-run, responsibly run businesses that can show that they have opportunities to use our money to create value over the long term. Long term for us can, sort of 5 to 10 years, which I would acknowledge is maybe short term relative to, developing an airport that's intended to be used for 50 years, but longer than might be a typical financial cycle. And that means that we have to take into account medium to longer term trends in both the general political and social environment, as well as what the traveling public are interested to do. So I'm not sure if that's directly on point to the question, but we're fundamentally looking to make productive, profitable investments. But in order to do that, we have to take a long-term view, but both for our investment period and also say when we exit, we have to convince the person we are selling an investment to that the next 10, 20 years are also good.
I'm quite intrigued to hear a private investor speaking of the sustainability. So it's quite interesting, and I want to come back to you about this topic a bit later. But we heard from Therese and the IDB about the importance of small enterprises and small businesses engaging in tourism, and 90% of the global tourism industry is comprised of micro and small and medium enterprises. And Minister Gasic, the bulk of Bosnia and Herzegovina is rural, and 2/3 of it is forest land. Sustainability, therefore, is key. And you can tell us about what you're doing to support these small and medium enterprises. I heard you speak yesterday about the whole idea of a micro-destination and the sustainability of these. I know you're also supporting a number of other investments under your portfolio. If you could share with us some of these examples.
First of all, I'm grateful to be here. It's excellent to have someone like you beside me. I have something to ask you afterwards. And yes, Republika of Srpska and Bosnia Herzegovina, most of the businesses are exactly the small and the medium enterprises. And government is doing a lot of things in previous period. beside these macro locations or destinations that we have in previous period, we are also supporting through different investments all kind of our locals primarily. There are some projects where government entered into something like public-private partnerships, yes. And it turned out as a great idea. And in terms of sustainability, that is something that we are fully aware there is no enterprise if it's not sustainable. Right. In terms of that, and every investment from the government also, we are trying to make it sustainable after some period, and we have several ways to do it. In some positions, in some projects, the government was providing a concession for the investor, and it turned out as a really good idea. Those are businesses that are for several years operating, and it was a very positive effect that has. Sustainability is something that we saw the government see it like involvement of locals. As we said previously and in previous panels that I've heard, we are trying to get locals involved in tourism sector completely, trying to, through tourism, to get the involvement and improvement on whole region, and locals from preparing foods to sell to restaurants. We also have a lot of small households, and we are trying to educate people, to get them involved, to feel what they have if engaged in tourism. Trying to get locals who will be eager to have tourists there, and at the same time to preserve nature. As you said, a lot of Republika Srpska and Bosnia Herzegovina are covered with woods and forests. So we have 2 national parks, and in future period and in previous also, we are expanding the protected areas, some natural parks, park of nature, to national parks which have own zones in which economy can grow. We are having tourists. Also with only Peručica is our rainforest, only one in Europe. Those, of course, there are zones that you cannot get in, but in surrounding, we are trying to get tourists, we are trying to involve locals to get into the tourist industry and to have sustainable industry, tourism industry that will involve everyone, to have positive effect for everyone and for the government as well.
Thank you. I want to also thank you for the plug about Peručica being the only rainforest in Europe. And of course, the minister is promoting while she's talking about development, because there are lots of onlys in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's quite a fascinating place. You know, Tara Canyon is the largest, of course, in Europe as well. So there are many distinguished assets. And it's interesting when you speak about expanding the protected areas and engaging the local community in them. That is important. That's one of the key themes that when countries are looking at how you protect nature, it's important that the local community is engaged, not just to benefit from them, because when they benefit, they also become conservators themselves. I'd like to say a note to the audience that we will have hopefully some time for questions after the speakers conclude their remarks. Hopefully the time will serve us. But Jerry, I know the minister spoke about local communities and engagement of local community, and I know that local community finance is dear to your heart. What can you tell us about some of the challenges and maybe new modes of finance for local communities?
Thank you very much, and thank you, colleagues, for having me on this event. Okay. I'm getting some feedback, sorry, I don't know why.
We can hear you fine.
Okay, fine. The work that we do is mostly based in rural areas in this area. And what you have found is that, with the new development in South Africa from the apartheid period to the post-apartheid, you had a lot of land that was given to communities. And communities, basically, it's land that was taken to them at the apartheid days. But the problem is that they don't have the skills to basically either farm that land or use it commercially and sustainably. But also it's very difficult for them to access funding to be able to do that. And for me, that has been a big area of focus where, as a private sector company, we have looked for opportunities to partner with them and bring in a little bit of equity so that we are able to help them to move ahead in terms of developing that land for tourism and other activities. But the work that we do tends to be very little. So we basically have been trying to speak to some of the development finance institutions to be able to give us some type of funding, whether it's a preferential funding for those communities or it's even equity that actually allows them to participate in projects. For instance, even actually as we speak today, we have just launched a project that is basically 10% owned by the community. We have given them free equity in that project, but we would like to increase that equity so that it's bigger and stronger for them. So we do need to find those clever models from the financial institutions to be able to do that.
Fascinating. Now, these financial institutions, are you seeing they're receptive with more maybe preferential credit lines for SMEs? Or how difficult is it for a small community organization or, say, for a small entrepreneur to access these financial institutions? Oftentimes, you go to the bank and it's like going to the dentist. It's a scary experience. You know, what are your views on this?
It's very difficult for them to handle this, Ibrahim, because they don't have the skills, one, to be able to put together the funding plans that financial institutions require, the way they make their decisions. So one has to hold their hand and develop those plans and make them what we call bankable. I think that's the word that I think is an important word in these instances. So you find yourself spending a lot of time demystifying finance, and that's really been the big challenge. And that comes about because financial institutions, particularly commercial banks, are designed for those who know the financial space. They are not designed for those who actually do not know about the financial space. So we try and actually work very closely with the DFIs, and I think quite a lot of them are beginning to look for partners like ourselves. So we hope that there'll be more who will crowd this space in, because there's a lot of work to be done and the scope is still absolutely huge.
Fantastic.
Sorry,
Minister,
if
yes.
I can add it, through this COVID period, the hospitality industry in total has difficulties to approach the bank fundings or any investments because they are risk area, and in sense of the COVID pandemic and everything, they've been having a really hard time to get fundings in this period. This is something that we are facing, and they're always trying to get some better conditions for applying, and that's also with us the same issue.
Absolutely, Minister. Thank you.
Yes. Absolutely. Now, just another, not plug, but information on what this USAID tourism project in Bosnia Herzegovina is doing. We're discovering, of course, the same way. We conducted a study that looked at probably 95% of the tourism sector in terms of a sample of their needs. That they identify the same thing. One, it's difficult for small and medium enterprises to present bankable applications. And that's no secret. It seems like it's a challenge everywhere in the world. But second, from the banking perspective, banks look with apprehension at the tourism sector. So one of the initiatives that we're going to be conducting is to work with the banks to better understand what the tourism sector is about, you know, and look at tourism from a value chain, complete industry perspective. So a tourism business isn't only a hotel or a tour operator, but you need to look at the whole supply chain that enables the tourism ecosystem to work. And that makes it reduces risk for the bank to allocate a portfolio to the tourism sector. We have many more businesses as your clients and to lend to. And at the same time, it makes them better understand how to underwrite these loan applications that come to them. Now, I want to round off this tourism finance circle by going to Paris. And Paris, you're involved in finance in a number of ways, but one completely different way we haven't spoken about yet is corporate social responsibility. And I can tell you something about Parish's work. He makes people cry, literally. And tell us why these people cry.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ibrahim. Can you hear me well?
Why did you make your people cry? I've
Well,
seen
can
them
you
cry
hear me?
in villages. I can hear you fine.
Wonderful. So we work at an altitude of 10,000 feet to 20,000 feet. That's the high Himalayas we work in. And we have been electrifying remote off-grid villages through solar power. And these are potential future destinations. And here tourism would thrive in the future. Now, if these destinations do not have any infrastructure, it will be very difficult for the travelers to come in and stay there for a while. So we have been conducting these so-called impact expeditions where we take travelers from all over the globe to electrify these remote villages. Now, these travelers are the ones who actually finance these clean technology solutions. So if you join our expedition, you not only have a memorable experience, but you have a lifelong experience of giving back to the community with an infrastructure which they will hold throughout their life. So that's what we have been doing, and having electrified more than 150 villages through solar power, we are trying to create future, you would say, low carbon destinations.
And just to demystify the crying, in one of the videos that earned you the award in London was how his organization was able to go for the first time to electrify these villages, where people saw electricity for the first time. It was really amazing. It was moving. But I want to go back to this interesting idea that you have with kind of an impact tour. They cost probably more money than an ordinary tour, no? Are people willing to pay a premium?
Yes, I mean, so yeah, let me demystify our impact expeditions to you. So a normal tour may cost you, let's say, X $1,000. To join our impact expedition, you probably have to pay 25 to 30% extra. And that is the cost of the tangible, clean technology infrastructure that you will provide to the community when you're there in the mountains with us. But not everyone does it from their own pocket, because it's a project which improves the livelihood or improves the well-being of the community. It can also get partially CSR funded by the participants from their own corporates. It is sometimes crowd-funded with their friends and fellows. It is also sometimes sponsored. So, in effect, I've seen a lot of travelers coming on our expedition who do not pay a single penny, and they get sponsored because of the good thing they plan to do. And in fact, they actually end up giving more amount of funding, which eventually brings the infrastructure to these villages. So I would say that it may not cost more, it may even cost less based on how do you pitch that expedition or your journey to your fellow mates.
Very interesting. Now, it may cost more or less for the individual, but the individual is bringing other monies with them. So they're getting sponsored. And from a viewpoint of the destination or the micro and small enterprises, these tours are spending more money.
Ibrahim, could I from a perspective of an investor and owner in several distribution and client-facing business, I think that what you're doing is fantastic. And many of the travel agents and tour operators that we work with and their clients are looking for that sort of thing, and will pay significantly more. And actually, part of the the value in the various intermediaries is finding those things and certifying that there are many social impact products or purported social impact. But what you're describing there it sounds like a fantastic experience, and actually doing something that is bringing a specific and tangible value to the destination that the tourist is going to. Because very often there are things where you go and it's a good immersive experience, but it's maybe not entirely necessary or value adding to the local community, other than a bit of show and tell. But I think what you were saying really resonates with me in terms of, will people pay more? Absolutely. I think that finding those though it may be counterintuitive to say, will someone pay more for something that may be a less enjoyable but more rewarding experience? Everything that we've seen says yes, and increasingly so. So, Parsha, that really resonates with me in terms of some of the themes we're seeing of what people are interested to do and how they want to spend their time and their money.
This is so important, this particular message, that oftentimes we hear from destinations, the infrastructure is not as good, the road network is not as good. And I always say, what's wrong with the road? It's fine. But the fact is that you're looking at infrastructure many times with tourism planning as the prerequisite. And you're talking about pristine road network necessarily or so forth as prerequisite to tourism development. It's what you're hearing from Jerry and confirmed by an investor that people are willing to pay more. Not everybody is, but we don't want everybody. We should be looking at value, deriving value to the destination. And value doesn't mean cheap tourism. It means maximizing value coming into the community, into the country. And that may mean more money, but it's okay, because if we want to preserve authenticity of the place and preserve nature of the place and preserve the culture of the place, preserve the architecture of the place, we want to charge more money. And if you're not interested, hey, don't come. Especially for destinations that are relatively small and pristine, like Bosnia Herzegovina. We want highest value tourists that are coming to respect nature and culture, and the same thing in other destinations, of course. I want to go back to the minister. We are hearing about public-private partnerships. Is that something that you think, is that the way forward for governments to think about? Because oftentimes you see assets owned by the government and managed by the government. Does that make sense to start looking at how do we engage a private sector in managing assets? Doesn't mean we need to sell them the asset or give them the asset, but the government still owns it, but they turn over management to it. Is that something that...
To attract the private investors, the investment is the most important thing for everyone, so it's for the government. Even through pandemic period, when it was a rough time, but investments shouldn't stop, and everyone's recommendation was that. Exactly, especially in touristic sector, we are trying to attract private investors. Exactly, as you said, government will be there for them to provide any support needed. Even in public-private relationships and partnerships, we are here to support maybe these, strict areas, legal requirements and everything else, and attract private investors to invest and together to bring out and develop a sustainable tourism in whole Republic of Srpska. There are several projects owned completely by the government. We have our Olympic Mountain, and it is a great investment from the government. And at the same time, we had attracted private sector also. Now we are balancing with, it's a big construction site, so we are trying, as you said, to preserve the nature, to preserve the sense and feel of the Olympic Mountain, and at the same time have a private sector to invest, to develop the destination, and that's something that we're balancing here. Also, one project, our Andrić Grad in Visegrad, it's owned by the government, but also encouraging private sector to go there, to invest. It's on the border with Serbia, so we have huge possibilities and options to develop, not only the Visegrad, the whole region, and we are exactly like that, or Olympic Mountain, trying to get development to whole region and to involve locals as much as possible, to have some growth with everyone, and of course, without some private investments, that's not it.
Right. Therese, is this from an IDB perspective? Are you interested in PPPs?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. This has been a really very valuable panel because, we're hearing, it's music to my ears because I think to hear from a private investor talk about value and impact is really important, but also to hear the minister talk about, being able to preserve the cultural and environmental assets that they have, I think is really important. I think just to round out, we need to really talk about the pandemic and the recovery a little bit, because I think all of these pieces come together. And Paris, congratulations, because I think what you're doing is extraordinary. And I'm making me think about some other, remote parts of the Caribbean where we don't have sustainable energy there. And of course, we've been talking about renewable energy for a long time in the Caribbean, and somehow we can't seem to land the targets of the government. But so I really like this idea of having the visitors come and do this kind of project. We're seeing some of that in other parts of the Caribbean. In the DR, I know you can do some kind of, work on a farm while you're vacationing in the Dominican Republic. But that hasn't really caught on much in the Caribbean. So I think there's a lot of work to do there. But PPPs have become really popular, probably for some of the wrong reasons. But I think, as the minister is saying, in this sort of very difficult economic environment now, governments are understanding that, okay, the asset we have could be land, could be even some hotel properties themselves, and we need investors to come either modernize or revitalize, promote the asset, and that's become it's a financial vehicle that we use to mobilize the private sector to get more involved in tourism. I think what's also important to mention, as the minister was saying, a lot of governments are currently quite stressed fiscally, and so there isn't a lot of room to do some of the investments that they need to do, including promotion or improving capability of their own officials to do what needs to be done in the tourism sector. So having the added value of the private money involved in tourism, I think, is really important. Of course, those deals, in my mind, have to be really structured properly. You want to make sure that the benefits accrue across the board. It's not all going to the private investor, but that the government is also able to get a good return on those investments. And sometimes we've seen in the past where PPPs have not really been structured properly. But I think there's a lot of attention now on PPPs to get the private sector involved to make these economies a little bit more dynamic at the moment. So yeah, we're all for that.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ibrahim.
Let me just run back to Jerry. Jerry, should we look at blended finance, a combination of grants and lending? Is that something that, when you're looking at community tourism, is that something necessary?
It's very, very necessary, and it assists a lot. Largely because grant funding allows you to come in on the front end, and you can start the project, do all the necessary front pieces, and get the project to the bankability stage. I think that, for me, is where grant funding becomes quite important. In some cases, particularly when you're dealing with communities, it could also form part of their equity, where you come into and you basically are approaching a commercial bank or someone like that. That grant funding goes a long way to actually give some sort of equity that the financial services entity can actually look to. So a combination of that grant funding and your normal debt, together with what we might call mezzanine funding, are also very important. So for me, it's different instruments that one has to look at here.
Very good. Let me go back to Paris. Paris, can we look at carbon offsets, carbon credits, as one form of finance for the tourism sector?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is something which you see a lot is being talked in the current scenario. And we would be at the COP26 this year. I mean, as part of the tourism enterprise, we won the UNFCCC Climate Action Award last year. But what we saw that the communities where we work, they have fragile ecosystems, and they rely heavily on fossil fuels. So any social intervention which you do in these communities, which probably offsets the carbon or removes the carbon from the source, is very beneficial for the corporates who are looking to offset, their carbon. So it becomes a very interesting mechanism to finance the projects, which could come from just deploying some, clean technology solutions and getting the credits for almost 20 years. So we have been doing this through smokeless cook stoves, solar centers for health centers, for villages, specifically residential accommodation. And all solar projects are 20 years, they have a long lifetime. And with the money which comes in through that, we are able to electrify more villages. So the tourism is off during the COVID times. We had no expeditions, but we started using the carbon credits, try getting our accreditation done. And our plan is to approach more corporates who are interested to get into net zero, but how would they get to net zero if they do not know where to invest in? So it's a win-win situation again for the corporates and for the communities using that carbon credit financing to uplift their own communities. Yeah.
Very well. I'm going to open it for the participants for any questions. But before I do that, one question for Henry. What's the minimum investment size you're looking for? What is too small for you to be involved in? Or the average investment, let's say.
So, surprisingly less straightforward. So we always say $100 million plus, but then whenever we consistently violate our own rule, when we see something that is interesting and on theme for us, we go down. We are also, likely in the next little while to have more of a venture fund, so that we can do smaller projects that don't fit within our traditional fund. So unfortunately, we are not set up to make sort of $20,000 local loans. So I think that may be a more productive or socially interesting thing to do. But we tend to be investing in larger, more established players, and that then tends to focus our areas of interest.
Including airport management companies and that sort of thing?
We haven't invested in an airport management company yet, but we absolutely would.
Good. But just the final point, a takeaway, I would say, and what you just mentioned, that you start at $100 million. However, if it's interesting, you're willing to finance it or look at it. And basically what we're seeing is an opening from the private investors to look at projects that are meaningful. And therefore, let's, as tourism developers, not only look at the pure financials and say, well, maybe an investor would not want to look at me, but if it is something compelling, it's worthwhile.
Maybe if I can add to that, sort of pulling together some themes we've heard from various speakers, that you shouldn't take sort of our threshold as sort of absolute for there are funds of different sizes, but when we're talking about public-private partnerships, one of the key things as we've looked at things, especially on the smaller side, is risk reward and return on investment. There are a lot of things that the governments can do that is not subsidy, that in terms of making it easier for an investor to get their head around the project or the company, whether it's are we sure that this destination is going to be open, that the rules for coming in are clear, that it's easy to get a visa, that I'm not going to get someone's not going to get arrested for a rule they didn't know existed. That all the things that sort of go towards, if I'm a travel agent sitting saying, I've got a customer who wants to go somewhere interesting, and they haven't gone before, am I comfortable sending them to Bosnia Herzegovina, where the travel agent may not have gone before, but I know that this project, this hotel is good, and the airport works, and the airline is sort of all of those different things which are important for confidence, and sort of move the risk side of the risk reward and make it easier to get a private investor, so they're not taking all the different risks at once.
You're reminding us about the importance of the ecosystem of tourism,
exactly.
Not just that a particular project.
Absolutely,
but the whole ecosystem.
And that sort of goes to if you were talking about airport management, say, you can't invest in airport management if you're not sure that, if you don't have a view on tourist flows.
Right.
So one of the things that's easier to say, if you're investing, you can have a high degree of confidence that people are always going to go to Paris, because they always have. If you're opening a new destination, you're investing in more moving pieces, and so the more comfort and certainty you can generate around the ecosystem, the easier it's, for better or worse, a positive or negative cycle.
Right. So looking at the marketing of the destination, the regulatory environment, and the enabling environment, and the investment environment.
And the marketing of destinations is actually really important. That if agencies, tour operators haven't been to a place or haven't heard of it, everyone's always looking for new product and new experiences, and that's more and more a trend of what people care about.
Yeah.
But getting top of mind and awareness is
key.
Critical.
Okay, I will open it now to, I think.
Actually, you asked most of the questions that I had, but I would like to make a few comments. My name is Gabriela, and I'm coming from USAID, Bosnia Herzegovina. The mission I actually.
Whenever I need the mic on.
Yes.
And I'm,
Before
I start talking,
just make
I'll
sure
try
in
to
the
look
interest of time also
understand.
concrete question if you have. Yeah, please.
Yes. I just want to introduce myself in the interest of the time so that people know where I'm coming from. I just want to make one comment talking about the Bosnia and Herzegovina as the destination that could be very interesting to the possible investors, and I'm grateful to the ministry for promoting Republika Srpska, which is one part of the country, but the country really has a lot of potential. In addition to that, it's a beautiful country, and we are hungry for the investors. And there are a lot of opportunities, the public-private partnerships and so on, but we don't have that culture. We really need help in that sense, because the banks, we have a very developed banking system, but they are very resistant to actually support micro, small, and medium enterprises. And and we know without supporting these small guys, there is not the development. How can we have big guys? And in terms of the private investment, we are actually very much interested in talking to the possible private investment funds, and it would be good to hear some your perspective when it comes. The banks are actually not only looking for there is no cash flow based investment. They're looking for the numbers. They don't have any business. They're not looking for the business cases. So that's the big problem. And so from the private investment point of view, we are very much interested in developing and understand your business model and what would make you actually become interested in Bosnia and Herzegovina or looking at some specific
There you
cases.
go. You just got yourself an invitation.
I'd love to discuss that further with you. Maybe a little complicated question to answer.
Well, we can
I'd be very happy to.
Let's do that.
That would be very, very
To
interesting.
share some non-expert opinions.
Ian Taylor, Travel Weekly.
Yeah, it's me. I have got a question. Teresa talked about the popularity of public-private partnerships, probably for the wrong reasons. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about that, but maybe not just Teresa, the other panelists. What should governments, destinations beware of, and how should they go about getting the right sort of partnership?
Well, Teresa, would you like to take this on?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when you're structuring a PPP, the real question is the risk. Who's assuming most of the risk, right? And of course, the private partner is going to try to minimize their risk exposure in any deal. So what we try to do is, build up the capacity of the governments we work with to be able to negotiate these PPP arrangements in a way that the risk is evenly spread between the government and the private sector. I think not all PPPs are bad PPPs, but I think there are a lot of holes that governments can fall into. We have built up a lot of experience over the years in how to do this and how to do this well. I think what you need is good advisory services when you're trying to structure such a deal. I agree. A lot of governments rush in thinking that it's a panacea for their fiscal problems. The fact that they have little room in their budgets to expand these kinds of investments. But I think there's a whole bunch of knowledge around this now that they can avoid those mistakes.
Very good. Yes, sir. You can introduce yourself as well.
Good morning. My name is Rui Faria, and I've been listening yesterday and today, and it seems to me that the main concern or the main focus is to go working with the locals and working with better quality and less tourists per infrastructure or per hotel or accommodation. Now, I work with many of those here in Portugal, with boutique hotels or isolated charm hotels that have to create their own infrastructures. And if we are going to go into a more better quality clients that are willing to pay more for a room, we have also to think about educating not only the visitants, as I referred that trying to see the tourist as a visitant, that is fantastic. But on the other hand is, we will be facing a lack of personnel, a lack of people working in these hotels. We're talking about here in this environment of Evra, we have many small hotels with between 10 and 50 rooms, which is not profitable enough to make it so that we have 2 or 3 rooms occupied, being seen as kings and actually educated as or treated as kings, okay? But we're focusing on an elite that then wants to see the roots of the environment, the local activity, but then who's going to make the communication?
So
who's
are you speaking about workforce development here, or are we talking about marketing of the destination?
I think that we have to look at this as an overall concept,
Right. Yes.
as having an hotel that is fantastic with a beautiful accommodation. But then we are talking about having the elite coming there that want to integrate with the locals that don't speak English, that are willing to open the doors to see how their handicraft is. But there must be an integrated view on this.
Yeah, thank you. It's an interesting view on how this relates to finance, but you may have a view on this, but I want to also hear from you as your answer. Are you also interested in PPPs, or you only look at pure private investment?
So quickly on PPP, I think it's not something that we do. In the narrow sense of PPP, it's an alternative financing structure of something the government would have done, but are leveraging third-party capital.
Do you give government credit for in-kind, for bringing you a castle and say, here is a castle, let's manage it? When you say $100 million, they're talking about cash, $100 million, not necessarily investment.
So I think that is the PPP in the classic sense is trying to either access capital that the government doesn't have or get cheaper capital. I think in the broader sense, there might the sort of partnership of was being discussed earlier, sort of selecting the developer who's going to bring a project that adds value. So I think that aspect, partnership is not typically PPP as defined as a financial instrument. So I think we are always interested in partnerships with local communities and government agencies in it for any of our businesses and how they do that. But we would not. Our fund is not set up. Simplistically speaking, our money is too expensive to be interesting for governments for infrastructure funding. But to the question that was just raised, I think that's a very interesting idea, and some of it is actually communication and expectation. That there are lots of people travelers who are interested to, be sort of frontier tourists in the sense of going somewhere that other people haven't been, and they know that people might not speak English. And the service may not be perfect. To give a stereotypical but easy example, Americans going to Paris have to be aware that an excellent French restaurant experience will be different from an excellent American restaurant experience. And it's not that they're doing it wrong. It's just you have to get used. You go there and you realize that how that works is different. And I think people know the famous examples, but finding the right, communicating what the experience is and what it is not. That if you say, if I was expecting to be going to a beautiful 5-star beach resort and it turns out there's no beach and no pool, I'm going to be upset. If I think I'm going to experience local culture and I know it may be a bit rough around the edges because I'm the first person here and everyone's going to be very friendly, but we may not communicate. I think that's something that can be done well, and if you get it right, there's a positive reinforcement loop of locals are happy, customers are happy, you get more customers.
Thank you. I'm supposed to close in exactly 1 minute because I need to hand it over to the wonderful Alessandra Briance from UNWTO, who's going to take us to the next session. But if I would violate the rule by another 30 seconds, and I go around to all of our speakers and the protocol says most important goes last, so minister goes last. And I would ask each one of you a sentence or two. What is your recommendation or the key takeaway for the conference, for the private sector, for governments to enhance access to finance in tourism? And Therese, I'll start with you. You have 20 seconds, just crisp.
Sure. I mean, I think that the real takeaway is that there's lots of opportunity. And I think putting the right partners together to discuss all of these issues. We're in 2021 with we're facing lots of challenges, and I think that no investor today can go in just thinking it's only about the financial return. There are lots of other considerations.
Wonderful. That's a key takeaway, I would say. Jerry, what do you think?
Yeah, I think just to add on to Therese's point, when you do that and you're working with communities, the temptation is for us to want to make money for the communities. And I think for me, the thinking should actually be make money or make an investment with the community. I think therein for me lies sustainability.
Excellent. And Paras?
I think collaboration is the way forward. I was very interested when Therese mentioned about Caribbean lack of electricity. So I think creating better low carbon destinations and giving financial literacy to the remote community so that the grassroots entrepreneurs can also access finance is very important. You cannot keep it to the elite players. You need to go down to the bottom and hit the last mile in terms of financing.
Thanks much, Henry. What's your takeaway?
I think if we start with what tourists want to do and where they want to go, and everything is downstream from that.
Excellent. Minister, we'll take a final takeaway from you.
Sure. Republic of Srpska and Bosnia Herzegovina is definitely a country of opportunity. I invite you to come, maybe not such a huge, but we will find some projects excellent. And I'd like to invite every one of you to come to see what we have to offer. Thank you.
Well, spoken like a true expert and a diplomat. So you all got invited. And we'd like to follow up on Ms. Vukmanch's question afterwards, because we have lots to explore on this. But I would like to thank everyone in the room.